There is a chapter in the Bible that makes seminary professors shift uncomfortably in their seats, that respected theologians have called one of the most dangerous passages in all of Scripture, that has been debated, buried, whispered about, and quietly avoided in Sunday sermons for over 1,000 years. And yet it sits right there in the opening pages of the Bible, impossible to ignore, refusing to be explained away, sitting between the genealogies of Genesis and the story of Noah's Ark like a locked door that almost no one in the modern church has the courage to open. Because behind that door is not a simple moral tale about good men marrying bad women, but a cosmic catastrophe involving divine beings crossing forbidden boundaries, the corruption of the human bloodline, giants walking the earth, and a God so grieved by what he saw that the text says it wounded him to his heart. And that chapter, the one your pastor skips over in 30 seconds on the way to the rainbow and the dove, is Genesis chapter 6. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us read the text as it was written, without the layers of theological interpretation that have been painted over it across the centuries. Genesis chapter 6 verse 1 reads, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. And they took them wives of all which they chose." Genesis chapter 6 verse 2. Right there, in those two verses, the entire controversy begins. Who are these sons of God? That phrase in Hebrew is Bnei Ha-Elohim, and that phrase is not ambiguous in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. In the book of Job, in chapter 1 verse 6 and chapter 2 verse 1, the same exact Hebrew phrase Bnei Ha-Elohim is used to describe heavenly beings who present themselves before God. These are not human beings, they are divine beings. They are members of what the ancient Hebrew worldview called the divine council, the heavenly court surrounding the throne of God. Then comes verse 4, perhaps the most extraordinary single verse in all of the Old Testament. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown, giants. The word in Hebrew is Nephilim. It comes from the root word nafal, which means to fall. The Nephilim, the fallen ones, or the ones who cause others to fall. These beings are described as Gibborim, a Hebrew word that means mighty ones, powerful warriors, heroes, and they are described as Anshe Hashem, men of name, men of renown. They are famous, they are legendary, and their existence, according to the text of Genesis chapter 6, is the direct product of a union between divine beings and human women. And then verse 5 arrives like a thunderclap. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And verse 6. One of the most startling statements in all of Scripture, and it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. God is grieved. God regrets creating humanity. And what follows is the flood, the total destruction of life on earth save for 8 souls carried aboard an ark. This is the sequence. The sons of God descend. They intermarry with human women. The Nephilim are born. Wickedness spreads across the whole earth. And God, in his grief, decides to start over. This is not a minor subplot. This is the cause of the flood. And the flood is, by any measure, the central catastrophic event of the primordial world in biblical theology. So why is this story, this crucial explanatory framework for why God judged the entire earth, almost never taught in church? The oldest interpretation, and why the church buried it. Here is something that most Christians sitting in pews on Sunday morning have never been told. The oldest interpretation of Genesis chapter 6, the interpretation held by virtually every Jewish and early Christian reader for hundreds of years, is that the sons of God were literally divine beings, angelic beings, who left their heavenly station and took human wives. This is not a fringe reading invented by conspiracy theorists on the internet. This is the consensus view of the ancient world. The Book of Enoch, also known as First Enoch, is one of the most important texts you have probably never heard of if you grew up in a mainstream church. Written primarily between circa 300 BCE and 100 BCE, with some portions potentially even older, First Enoch is an ancient Jewish text that expands on the events of Genesis chapter 6 inches extraordinary detail. The author, writing under the name of Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah mentioned in Genesis chapter 5, describes the descent of 200 divine beings he calls the Watchers onto a mountain called Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a real place. It sits at the northern boundary of ancient Israel, on the border of what is today Lebanon and Syria. Its peak reaches 9,232 feet above sea level, and according to 1 Enoch chapter 6 verses 1 through 6, it was on this mountain that the Watchers swore an oath to one another, bound together by a collective pact, before descending to take human wives. The leader of this group is named in 1 Enoch as Shemihaza, and under him are 200 named Watchers, each presiding over a specific kind of forbidden knowledge transmitted to humanity. According to 1 Enoch, these Watchers taught humanity skills that God had not sanctioned. Their leader Azazel, described in chapter 8, taught men how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught women the arts of beautification, the use of eye paint and the dyeing of cloth, the art of seduction. Other Watchers taught astrology, the cutting of roots and herbs for medicinal and magical use, enchantments, and the reading of omens. In the view of 1 Enoch, the corruption of the antediluvian world was not simply moral, it was technological and spiritual. A premature transmission of forbidden celestial knowledge into the hands of an immature humanity. The Nephilim born from the union of Watchers and women are described in 1 Enoch chapter 7 as growing to enormous height. 300 cubits in some manuscript traditions, consuming so much food that they eventually turned on human beings themselves, devouring them, and then turning on animals, and then on one another. Their violence filled the earth. Their spirits, 1 Enoch teaches, did not return to the heavenly realm when their bodies died at the time of the flood. Instead, they became the evil spirits that roam the earth and afflict humanity. This is the origin of demons, according to the theology of 1 Enoch. Now here is what makes this so significant. 1 Enoch was not considered a marginal or eccentric text in the ancient world. It was enormously popular and widely considered authoritative. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in 1,947 inches caves near Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, contained multiple copies of 1 Enoch in Aramaic, making it one of the most represented texts in the entire Qumran library. At least 11 separate manuscript fragments of 1 Enoch were found at Qumran, suggesting that the community that preserved those scrolls considered it essential scripture. Moreover, the New Testament itself appears to be aware of this tradition. The letter of Jude, verse 14 through 15, explicitly quotes 1 Enoch chapter 1 verse 9 as a prophetic text, attributing it to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. The Apostle Peter, in his second letter, chapter 2 verse 4, writes that God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. The Greek word used for hell in that passage is Tartarus, a term borrowed directly from Greek mythology, referring to the lowest pit of the underworld. This is a direct allusion to the judgment of the Watchers, as described in 1 Enoch, and in the letter of 1 Peter, chapter 3, verses 19 through 20, the author speaks of Christ going to preach unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. These imprisoned spirits, bound and waiting for judgment, are the Watchers of 1 Enoch. The New Testament writers knew this story. They referenced it. They treated it as genuine history. So when did this understanding disappear from mainstream Christianity? Augustine and the Great Suppression. The answer to that question leads us to one man more than any other. Augustine of Hippo, born in 354 CE in the city of Thagaste, in the Roman province of Numidia, in what is today northeastern Algeria. Augustine died in 430 CE in the city of Hippo Regius on the North African coast, as Vandal armies were laying siege to the city walls. In the decades between his birth and death, Augustine produced a volume of theological writing so enormous and so influential that it essentially defined Western Christianity for the next 1500 years. Augustine was deeply uncomfortable with the idea that divine beings, angels, had taken on physical form and produced physical offspring with human women. He found it philosophically troubling and theologically destabilizing. And so, in his monumental work, The City of God, written between 413 CE and 426 CE, Augustine reinterpreted the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 as the male descendants of Seth, the godly line of humanity. The daughters of men, in his reading, were the female descendants of Cain, the ungodly line. The sin described in Genesis chapter 6 was therefore simply intermarriage between the righteous and the wicked, a mundane moral failure rather than a supernatural catastrophe. Augustine was not the first to propose this interpretation. Julius Africanus, a Christian scholar writing in Alexandria, Egypt around 221 CE, had suggested something similar. But it was Augustine's version that carried the day, because Augustine's theological authority in the Latin West was essentially without peer. When Augustine decided something, the Western Church accepted it. And what was swept away in Augustine's reinterpretation? Everything. The entire cosmological framework of Genesis chapter 6, the transgression of cosmic boundaries, the corruption of the created order by beings from outside it, the physical offspring of heaven and earth, the imprisoned spirits that became the explanation for demonology, all of it was flattened into a story about endogamy and exogamy, about which tribe you are allowed to marry into. The earlier church fathers had held a very different view. Justin Martyr, writing around 155 CE in his second apology, stated plainly that angels had transgressed their station, had intercourse with women, and begotten sons who were called demons. Tertullian of Carthage, writing between approximately 197 CE and 220 CE, devoted extensive portions of his works on the veiling of virgins and on the apparel of women to the Watcher tradition, arguing that women should cover their hair in part because it was female beauty that had originally tempted the angelic watchers into their fall. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 190 CE to 200 CE, also accepted the supernatural reading. Even Origen of Alexandria, writing in the early 3rd century, the great systematizer of Christian theology before Augustine, grappled seriously with the Watcher tradition, though he grew increasingly uncomfortable with its physical implications as his theology developed. Augustine's reinterpretation was not driven purely by theological refinement, it was also driven by cultural pressure. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine from 306 CE, and then under Theodosius from 380 CE, the Church needed to present itself as philosophically respectable to the educated Greco-Roman world. The idea of angels impregnating human women sounded far too much like the myths of the Greeks and Romans, the stories of Zeus descending to sleep with mortal women and produce demigods like Hercules and Achilles. The institutional church wanted distance from those stories, and so the supernatural reading of Genesis chapter 6 was quietly retired, ancient Near Eastern parallels, and what they reveal. But here is the problem with Augustine's reinterpretation. When you look at Genesis chapter 6 inches, its original ancient Near Eastern context, the supernatural reading is not only the most natural reading, it is virtually unavoidable. Consider the Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in Akkadian cuneiform and written down in its most complete surviving form, the standard Babylonian version, around circa 1200 BCE at Nineveh in what is today northern Iraq. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of a legendary king of Uruk, one of the oldest cities in the world, located in what is today southern Iraq. Gilgamesh is described in the opening lines of the epic as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He is a product of a union between a divine being and a mortal woman. He is a mighty hero. He is a builder of legendary walls. He is a man of renown. Sound familiar? Gilgamesh, in the Akkadian literary tradition, is precisely the kind of being the Genesis text calls a Gibor, and a member of the Anshe Hashem, a man of name, a man of renown. And embedded within the Epic of Gilgamesh is the story of a great flood, preserved most fully in Tablet 11 of the standard Babylonian version. In that story, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea to build a great boat and fill it with the seed of all living things. because the divine assembly has decided to destroy humanity with a flood. Utnapishtim survives. He releases birds to find dry land. He offers a sacrifice after the waters recede. The parallels with the Noah narrative are so precise that when the tablet was first read publicly by George Smith of the British Museum on the 3rd of December 1872, at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, the audience was reportedly stunned into silence. What this tells us is that the ancient world was saturated with stories of divine beings interacting physically with humanity, producing hybrid offspring, and of a catastrophic flood sent to reset the corrupted human experiment. These are not Judeo-Christian inventions. They are pan-cultural memory, recurring across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Canaanite, Greek, and Hindu traditions with remarkable consistency. The Sumerian King List, a text dating to circa 2100 BCE, records a list of ancient kings with impossibly long reigns, kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood. After the flood, the reigns dramatically shortened to human scale. The text itself marks the flood as a dividing line between two eras of human history, the antediluvian age of gods and demigods, and the post-diluvian age of ordinary humanity. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the beings who brought civilization to humanity before the flood were called the Apkalus, 7 divine sages who were described as creatures that were part man and part fish, rising from the primordial waters to teach humanity the arts of civilization, mathematics, architecture, irrigation, and law. The later Babylonian writer Berossus of Babylon, writing in Greek around 290 BCE during the reign of Antiochus I, preserved this tradition in his work Babyloniaca, which survives only in fragments quoted by later writers like Alexander Polyhistor and Eusebius of Caesarea. Berossus described these antediluvian sages as anidatoi, meaning the repulsive ones, who came from the sea to civilize humanity. When the authors of Genesis chapter 6 wrote about the sons of God descending and taking human wives, and about the Nephilim becoming the mighty men of old and men of renown, they were engaging with a shared ancient Near Eastern cultural memory about a primordial age when the boundary between the divine and human worlds was not as fixed as it later became. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Book of Giants. Discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls beginning in 1947 brought with it not only fragments of 1st Enoch, but an entirely separate text that had been lost to history for nearly 2,000 years. That text is called the Book of Giants. The Book of Giants is an Aramaic text, and manuscript fragments of it were found in Cave 1, Cave 4, and Cave 6 at Qumran. It was originally composed, scholars believe, between circa 200 BCE and 100 BCE. It expands on the traditions of 1st Enoch and describes the lives of the Nephilim giants, including 2 specific sons of the Watcher, Shemihaza, named Oya and Aya, and the most famous Watcher offspring of all, a giant named Marway. In the fragments that survive, these giants have prophetic dreams of tablets being brought from heaven, tablets that foretell their doom, that describe how the flood is coming as a divine judgment specifically against them. The Book of Giants was not only known at Qumran, it was so widely distributed across the ancient world that a version of it, heavily modified but still recognizable, was adopted by the Manichaean religion, the religious movement founded by the Persian prophet Mani, born in 216 CE in what is today Iraq. Manichaean versions of the Book of Giants were found in Turfan, in the Xinjiang region of what is now western China, discovered by German archaeological expeditions between 1902 CE and 1914 CE. This means a tradition rooted in a 4-line passage from Genesis chapter 6 travelled from ancient Israel to Central Asia, surviving in fragments across thousands of miles and nearly 2,000 years of religious transformation. In 1956, the scholar John C. Reeves published groundbreaking work on identifying the Manichaean Turfan fragments as related to the Qumran Book of Giants. Later scholars, including Lauren Stuckenbrook, whose comprehensive study published in 1997 remains the standard academic treatment of the text, further demonstrated the extraordinary reach and longevity of this tradition. This is not mythology from the margins of ancient religion. This is one of the most widely transmitted traditions in the ancient world. The seed of Lee died, and it all flows from 4 verses in Genesis chapter 6. The Septuagint and what the translators knew. Another layer of this story that is almost never discussed in church is what the ancient translators of the Hebrew Bible did with Genesis chapter 6. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced in Alexandria, Egypt, beginning around circa 270 BCE during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. According to the letter of Aristeas, a document written sometime between 200 BCE and 100 BCE, 72 Jewish scholars from Jerusalem were brought to Alexandria to produce this translation, which is why it is called the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70. It is abbreviated in scholarly literature as LXX. When the translators of the Septuagint came to Genesis chapter 6 verse 2, they did not soften the language. They translated Bene ha Elohim, the sons of God, directly as hoi hui oi tu theu, the sons of God, and in some manuscript traditions as hoi angeloi tu theu, the angels of God. These translators, Jewish scholars working in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, who were intimately familiar with their own tradition, had no hesitation in reading the text supernaturally. For them, it was not even a question. The sons of God were divine beings. And when they translated the word Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6 verse 4, they used the Greek word gigantes, from which we get the English word giants. But gigantes in Greek mythology had a very specific meaning. They were not simply large humans. The gigantes of Greek mythology were the offspring of Gaia, the earth goddess, who rose up against the Olympian gods. They were hybrids, beings of mixed divine and earthly origin. The translators of the Septuagint chose this word deliberately because it captured exactly what they understood the Hebrew Nephilim to mean. The Septuagint was the Bible of the early church. It was the text that Paul quoted from. It was the text that the author of the letter to the Hebrews quoted from. It was the text that the early church fathers read. And in that text, the sons of God were angels, and the Nephilim were divine human hybrids. This was not a fringe reading in the early church. It was the reading of the Bible that the early church actually had. Why modern pastors avoid it? So now we arrive at the central question. Why do modern pastors avoid Genesis chapter 6? There are several reasons, and they build on each other in ways that reveal something important about the relationship between institutional religion and uncomfortable truth. The first reason is the Augustine problem. Most seminary graduates in the Western Christian tradition are trained within a theological framework that is, whether they know it or not, profoundly Augustinian. Augustine's influence on Western theology, both Catholic and Protestant, is so total that his reinterpretation of the sons of God as the Sethite lineage became the default assumption. By the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, on the 31st of October 1517, the Augustinian reading had been the consensus for over 1,000 years. Luther himself, along with John Calvin writing in Geneva between 1536 CE and 1564 CE, accepted the Sethite interpretation. It was simply what you believed if you were a serious Christian theologian. The second reason is the cosmological problem. Christian. If the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 are genuinely divine beings, then the universe of the biblical text is far more populated, far more complex, and far more dangerous than most modern Christians are comfortable acknowledging. The standard contemporary evangelical cosmology is essentially a two-tiered system, God above and humanity below, with angels as messengers who occasionally appear but do not interact substantively with the material world. A serious engagement with Genesis chapter 6, with First Enoch, with the Book of Giants, with the Watcher tradition, reveals that the biblical authors held a much more layered cosmological vision, one in which divine beings administered regions and nations, could rebel and corrupt those assignments, and could interact physically with the material world in ways that had permanent consequences for human history. This is the cosmology worked out in extraordinary detail by the scholar Michael S. Heiser, who earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and worked as a scholar in residence for Logos Bible Software in Bellingham, Washington, until his death in February of 2023. His 2015 book, The Unseen Realm, and his more accessible 2019 work, Demons, argued that the ancient Israelite divine council worldview is not peripheral to biblical theology. It is the framework within which the entire biblical story operates. Heiser spent years pointing out that Genesis chapter 6, properly understood in its ancient context, transforms your understanding of why God commanded the Israelites to utterly destroy the Canaanites, why the territory of Mount Hermon was of special significance in the New Testament, and why Psalm chapter 82 describes God judging the members of his own divine council. The third reason pastors avoid it is the Enoch problem. If first Enoch is the interpretive background for Genesis chapter 6, and if the New Testament authors appear to quote it and reference it as authoritative, then the question inevitably arises, why is first Enoch not in the Bible? This is a question that, once asked, does not go away quietly. The answer involves the Council of Laodicea, held approximately in 363 CE, which excluded first Enoch from the canonical list, and the gradual standardization of the biblical canon across the 4th and 5th centuries CE. But the question itself is uncomfortable for pastors who have built their ministry on the authority and completeness of the 66-book Protestant canon, because it raises the broader question of how canonical decisions were made and by whom. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, first Enoch has been considered canonical scripture continuously from ancient times to the present day. The Ethiopian Church, one of the oldest Christian communities on earth, tracing its origins to the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, has never removed first Enoch from its Bible. When you sit in a church in Addis Ababa today and hear scripture read, first Enoch is part of that reading. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books, significantly more than either the Protestant 66 or the Catholic 73. And at the heart of that expanded canon is the Enochian tradition, the tradition the Western Church spent 17 centuries trying to forget. The fourth reason is what we might call the mythology problem. Modern Western Christians are deeply conditioned to think of the miracles and supernatural events of the Bible as categorically different from the mere myths of other ancient cultures. The idea that the Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6 are related to the Titans of Greek mythology, or the Apkalus of Babylonian tradition, or the Anunnaki of Sumerian cosmology, that feels dangerous to many pastors because it seems to imply that the Bible is just mythology. But this is a false dilemma. The presence of shared traditions across cultures does not make those traditions untrue. It may, in fact, indicate that they preserve a genuine memory of real events, encoded and interpreted differently by different cultures, but pointing back to the same historical substrate. When the archaeologist Austin Henry Layard excavated the ancient city of Nineveh in what is today northern Iraq between 1845 CE and 1851 CE, he discovered the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, built in the 7th century BCE and containing over 30,000 clay tablets. Among those tablets were the cuneiform records of Babylonian astronomy, medicine, literature, and mythology, including the Epic of Gilgamesh. George Smith of the British Museum spent years deciphering those tablets, and when he published his findings about the Babylonian flood story in 1872 CE, the world was confronted with evidence that the biblical flood narrative existed within a larger ancient Near Eastern tradition. The initial response from the religious establishment was panic, but the honest response, then as now, is not panic but inquiry. The chapter, They Buried, We Are Left. Then, with a picture that is both more ancient and more coherent than anything most of us were taught in church. Genesis chapter 6 is not a confusing interlude before the flood story. It is the explanation for the flood story. It tells us that the created order was fundamentally corrupted, not merely by human moral failure, but by a transgression of cosmic boundaries. A rebellion of divine beings who abandoned their proper station and interfered with the human world in ways that polluted the entire antediluvian civilization. God's response was not the action of a tyrant, but of a creator watching his creation unravel from the inside out. The scholars who have taken this text seriously, from Devorah Dimant at the University of Haifa to George Nicholsberg of the University of Iowa, whose critical edition of First Enoch, published by Fortress Press in 2001, remains the definitive academic treatment to the late Michael Heiser, have spent careers demonstrating that this reading is not only historically defensible, but is, in fact, the only reading that makes sense of the whole biblical canon from Genesis to Revelation. The Church buried this chapter not because it is unimportant, but because it is too important. It forces questions about the nature of reality, about the structure of the unseen world, about the reliability of canonical decisions made in council chambers in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, about the relationship between the biblical text and the wider ancient world from which it emerged. These are not questions that fit neatly into a 45-minute sermon between the announcements and the offering, but they are exactly the questions that truth demands we ask. Genesis chapter 6 is not the chapter the church forgot. It is the chapter the church was afraid to remember.